You have shamed this house. You have shamed your father. And a disgraced woman has no place under my roof.
You are no longer welcome here. Leave now.
Please, stepmother, I have nowhere to go.
That is not my concern.
The storm arrived without apology. It did not creep across the sky the way polite English weather often did, with a grey warning and a distant rumble of thunder that gave one time to draw the curtains and stoke the fire. No. This storm descended on Wiltshire like a verdict already decided, tearing through the elm trees that lined the Collins estate and scattering their leaves into the dark, soaked courtyard like accusations too numerous to gather back. It was the kind of night that made even the bravest souls step back from the window. And yet Miss Abigail Collins was not inside, standing at a window. She was on her knees, in the mud, in the rain, in the cold. Her gown, a deep blue silk with delicate embroidery along the hem, the finest she owned, the one she had carefully preserved for formal occasions, was soaked through, the fabric clinging to her shaking frame and dragging in the dirt beneath her palms. Her auburn hair, which Lucy had spent the better part of an hour pinning and pressing into elegant curls before supper, now hung in wet, tangled ropes against her pale face. She did not move. Not because she was broken, though she felt it. Not because she was defeated, though the night suggested it. She did not move because shock had arrived before grief, and it had taken the full weight of her breath with it. Behind her, lit by the warm amber glow of the Collins estate's entrance lanterns, which burned without mercy while she shivered without shelter, stood Margaret Collins, Abigail's stepmother. Margaret was dressed in a deep burgundy evening gown of imported Venetian silk, her pearls resting precisely at her throat, but every strand of her gold-streaked hair curled and pinned as though she were hosting a dinner party rather than casting a young woman into a storm. She stood beneath the dry shelter of the manor's stone archway, with the practiced ease of a woman who had rehearsed this exact moment in the private theatre of her own imagination many times before. Behind her, half hidden in the doorway shadows, stood 2 housemaids, a footman, and old Mr. Graves, the butler, all witnesses, all silent. Margaret had wanted witnesses. That was the point entirely. "You have shamed this house," Margaret declared, her voice carrying the calm, measured authority of someone who had spent 20 years learning exactly how much damage a quiet voice could do. "You have shamed your father, and a disgraced woman has no place under my roof." She did not shout, and she did not need to. The words fell like stone into still water, and the ripples would travel far. The door shut, not slammed. That would have been too passionate, too honest. It closed with a precise, final click, the way the lid of a coffin closes, with a certainty that left no room for argument. The rain swallowed everything. Abigail pressed her fingers into the wet gravel beneath her palms and tried, very deliberately, to breathe. In Victorian England, in the year of our Lord 1884, a young woman's reputation was not simply a matter of pride. It was the architecture of her entire future. Without it, there were no prospects, no marriage, no social standing, no inheritance claim. Without it, she was a ghost, still breathing but already erased from the world that had known her. And Margaret Collins, and with the cool precision of a woman who had studied these mechanisms her entire life, had just used them like a weapon. Abigail was 24 years old. She was intelligent, educated, and had done nothing wrong. None of that mattered tonight. What mattered was what people believed, and Margaret had made very sure they believed the worst. Abigail was still kneeling when she heard it, the distant, rhythmic sound of hooves on the wet stone road beyond the estate gates, coming closer, then stopping. She did not look up. She had no reason to expect mercy from anyone who arrived at this estate on this night. But the gate opened. Boots, polished, firm, deliberate, struck the courtyard stones. They stopped 2 feet from where she knelt. A long pause. Then a hand appeared in her line of vision. Open, extended, unhurried. It was a man's hand, gloved in black leather, steady as a barrister's argument. Abigail looked up. The man standing over her was tall, lean, and dressed in a well-tailored black coat with a white shirt beneath it, partially open at the collar, because the rain had pulled at him the same way it pulled at everything else. His dark hair was damp against his forehead. His jaw was set. His eyes, grey, deep, and entirely unreadable, were fixed on her with an expression she could not name. It was not pity. It was not curiosity. It was something closer to recognition, the look of a man who had, perhaps, seen injustice worn on someone's face before and knew exactly what it looked like. He did not say a word. He simply kept his hand extended and waited. Behind him, the black aristocratic carriage stood at the gate, its brass lanterns burning warm and gold against the blue-black storm. The horses were restless, but held. Abigail Collins stared at that open hand for 3 full seconds. Then, with what remained of her dignity, which was, she discovered in that moment, considerably more than she had thought, she took it. Hey, quick question. How are you feeling right now? Thank you so much for being here. It really means the world to me. It is essential that we get your support through subscriptions, likes, and comments. So if this story is already pulling at your heart, please hit that subscribe button for us, smash the like, and drop a comment telling us where you are watching from. It helps more than you know. All right? Thank you. Now let's get back to the story. The Collins estate, known in county records as Hartwell Park, had once been a house of laughter. Abigail remembered it with the kind of selective, tender clarity that only the loss of something good can produce. She remembered her mother, the first Mrs. Collins, Eleanor, moving through these same halls with an easy grace, her voice full of warmth, her presence in a room like a lamp turned on. She remembered her father, Baron Jack Collins, laughing, actually laughing, the kind that came from somewhere genuine, as he read the evening papers while Eleanor sat beside him, quietly sewing, occasionally commenting on something that made them both smile. That was before Eleanor died. Abigail had been 14, old enough to understand the loss, too young to protect herself from what came after. Baron Jack Collins had remarried within 2 years. It was, his solicitor had advised him, the practical thing to do. A man of his standing required a capable household manager and a mother figure for his young daughter. Mrs. Margaret Harwick, a widow of respectable social position but modest fortune, had presented herself with flawless timing, offering exactly what she appeared to offer: composure, social skill, and a quiet efficiency that Jack Collins, still grieving and disoriented, had mistaken for warmth. It had taken years for Abigail to understand the difference. Margaret was not cruel in ways that left marks. She was too sophisticated for that. She was cruel in ways that could be denied in polite company. A withheld compliment here, a perfectly timed public correction there, a subtle and consistent redirection of every room's attention away from Abigail and toward her own daughter, Phoebe, who was 10 years younger, a softer-tempered and entirely unaware of the mechanisms her mother was operating on her behalf. Phoebe Collins was 14 years old that autumn, golden-haired and sweet-natured, and Abigail did not blame her for a single thing. Phoebe did not choose her mother's schemes. She was simply the beneficiary of them, the way a flower benefits from a gardener's careful weeding of everything around it. It was the inheritance that had changed everything. This was something Abigail had only recently come to understand, piecing it together from fragments, a document she had seen briefly on her father's desk, a conversation she had caught between Margaret and the family solicitor, Mr. Aldridge, that stopped the moment she entered the room. Under the terms of Baron Collins' original will, the one written before Margaret arrived, a significant portion of the estate and its income was designated for Abigail upon her marriage or her father's death, whichever came first. It was not everything, but it was enough. Enough to give Abigail independence, enough to give her choices, enough, crucially, to reduce what Phoebe would inherit. And Margaret Collins had not spent 4 years cultivating this household to watch a stepdaughter walk away with a significant share of its future. In September of 1884, 3 things were true simultaneously. Abigail had received a proposal of marriage from Mr. Luca Williams, a young barrister of good standing and genuine affection for her, which would have triggered her inheritance claim. Margaret had discovered this, and a silver brooch belonging to Margaret had gone missing from her dressing table. What followed was not accidental. "I found it in Miss Abigail's room," Margaret told Jack Collins, holding the brooch in her palm with an expression of carefully constructed reluctance, the face of a woman who did not want to accuse but had no other choice. "I am sure there is an explanation," she said carefully. "But given what else I have heard, the conversation Lucy witnessed between Abigail and Mr. Williams, the nature of their arrangement as the servants describe it, I felt you ought to know the full picture before any decisions are made." The full picture that Margaret painted was meticulous and devastating. A theft, a secret and improper arrangement with a man, clandestine meetings that violated every principle of respectable female conduct, whispered reports, amplified by Margaret's careful repetition, that spread through the servants' hall, and from there to the drawing rooms of nearby houses faster than any official announcement could have managed. By the time Abigail knew what had been said about her, it had already been believed. Baron Jack Collins, a man of genuine decency, but limited emotional perceptiveness, who had spent 20 years relying on the women in his household to manage its social complexities, looked at his daughter across the dinner table one evening with the expression of a man already convinced and already grieving for it. "Is any of it true?" he asked. "Not. Tell me it is false." "Not. I trust you." Simply, "Is it true?" The distance in that question told Abigail everything she needed to know about what evidence she was up against. "Or none of it," she said. "Not a single word." He said nothing further, but he did not send Margaret away to correct the rumors. And that silence, Abigail would later understand, was its own kind of verdict. Mr. Gabriel Austin arrived at Hartwell Park on a Tuesday morning, uninvited and entirely unwelcome as far as Margaret was concerned. He was a solicitor of the new school, young, sharp, and possessed of the unsettling conviction that truth was a thing worth locating, even when the comfortable parties involved would have preferred it remain lost. He had been a school friend of Luca Williams, and when Luca came to him in distress after hearing what had been said about Abigail, Gabriel had made discreet inquiries. He was shown into the morning room, where Abigail sat with her embroidery frame, doing nothing useful with it. Or Phoebe was in the garden. Margaret was, unfortunately for Gabriel's purposes, present. "Miss Collins," Gabriel said, with a measured respect that drew Margaret's immediate attention. "I represent the interests of Mr. Luca Williams, who is understandably distressed by recent events. He wishes me to convey, first and most importantly, that he does not believe a word of what has been circulated." Abigail looked up sharply. Beside her, she felt rather than saw Margaret stiffen. "How kind," Margaret said smoothly, before Abigail could speak. Though I am not certain this is the appropriate channel for such sentiments. My stepdaughter is not receiving formal communications of a personal nature at this time. I understand, Gabriel said, with equal smoothness. However, I am also here in a secondary capacity, to ask whether Miss Collins is aware that the alleged evidence against her, specifically the brooch, was retrieved from a location that the upstairs housemaid, a Miss Lucy, reports she can verify was not Miss Abigail's room, but was in fact the corridor outside your dressing room, Mrs. Collins. Silence, the kind that precedes either a confession or a war. Margaret chose war. I think, she said, very quietly, or that you should leave. Gabriel Austen left, but not before he had met Abigail's eyes across the room and given her the smallest possible nod, the kind that said, "I have seen what I came to see. You are not alone in this." It was, Abigail reflected, the most useful thing anyone had done for her in several weeks. Lucy, small, steady, faithful Lucy, who had served the Collins household for 3 years, and who had, until now, kept her observations to herself out of the very reasonable fear of losing her position, had told Gabriel Austen the truth. She had seen Margaret herself place the brooch in the alcove off the main corridor. She had said nothing, because Margaret had looked at her in the particular way that told her silence was the price of her continued employment. But she had remembered. And when the right person came asking the right questions, remembering was enough to begin unraveling everything. What Gabriel had not yet known, and what he would spend the next several weeks working to prove, was that the brooch was only the beginning. Margaret had gone further. She had obtained, through means Abigail could not yet fully trace, access to a letter that Luca Williams had sent to Abigail, a proper, respectful letter of courtship, and had shown it to 3 women of the local society, with a particular emphasis on certain phrases that, stripped of their context, could be made to suggest an improper familiarity. Mrs. Victoria Hayward, wife of the county magistrate, they had received a version of the story so carefully constructed that it included not just the theft accusation, but a whispered implication about the nature of Abigail's relationship with Williams that would have destroyed the reputation of a duchess, let alone a baron's daughter. Victoria Hayward was, as it happened, a woman of sharper conscience than Margaret had calculated for. She said nothing public, but she did not believe it either, and she filed the inconsistencies away with the careful attention of a woman who had been lied to before and had learned to mark the shape of it. None of this, however, reached Abigail in time, because on the Thursday of that same week, Margaret made her move. She chose a dinner party for it. Naturally. The Hargreaves of Dunmore Hall were hosting their autumn gathering. 12 families, or 30-odd guests, the kind of event that functioned in the social architecture of Victorian Wiltshire as both entertainment and public record. What was said or seen at a Hargreaves dinner party was considered, for all practical purposes, fact. Margaret had dressed Abigail carefully that evening. This was itself unusual. She rarely concerned herself with Abigail's appearance, and she had done it with the attentive precision of someone arranging a stage. The deep blue silk gown, the pearl earrings, the careful updo that Lucy had constructed with something close to dread, sensing without knowing the shape of what was coming. "You look very well tonight," Margaret told her at the foot of the stairs, with a smile that Abigail, in retrospect, should have recognized as the smile of a general surveying a battlefield already won. Of the dinner itself was pleasant. That was the cruelty of it. To have the evening begin so well, to have Abigail speak with people who still knew her as herself, to have a glass of claret pressed into her hand and feel, briefly, normal. Then Margaret's timing arrived. Between the second and third courses, while the footman moved between the tables and the conversation hummed with the self-satisfied murmur of people who had everything they needed, Margaret leaned toward Mrs. Hargreaves and said something. Just a few words. Quietly, with the appropriate expression of reluctant disclosure. 3 minutes later, Mrs. Hargreaves looked at Abigail with different eyes. The look spread the way these things always spread in Victorian drawing rooms, not through shouts or confrontations, which would have been manageable, but through glances. A slight withdrawal, a redirect of conversation, a sudden, slight cooling in the temperature of the room that Abigail felt without being able to identify its source, the way one feels a draft from a door that has been opened in another part of the house. She was seated beside Mr. Frederick Hargreaves, who began to find reasons to address his other neighbour. The women across from her found their attention called elsewhere. And through all of it, Margaret sat 2 seats down, with the composed pleasure of a woman watching an investment pay out. The evening ended early for Abigail. A headache, she said. She was driven home in the Collins carriage, while her father and Margaret remained at the dinner. But when she arrived at Hartwell Park, the real act was waiting. Margaret had sent a footman ahead. The household staff were assembled. Abigail's small trunk, hastily packed, improperly packed, the kind of packing done under instruction and in haste, sat in the entrance hall. And Mrs. Graves, the housekeeper who had served the Collins family for 12 years, and whose face that night was a landscape of suppressed guilt, stood in the hallway and could not meet Abigail's eyes. Abigail had barely stepped through the door before she understood. She stood very still for a moment. She looked at the trunk. She looked at the assembled servants. She thought, with extraordinary clarity for someone in the first stages of shock, of every step she had watched Margaret take over the past 4 years, and she understood, truly understood, perhaps for the first time, the full architecture of what had been built around her. Margaret arrived home 30 minutes later. The scene in the courtyard followed with the exactness of a well-rehearsed performance, because it was exactly that. The public declaration of disgrace, the careful statement designed for servant ears and, through them, for every drawing room in the county. The shut door, the rain, Abigail on her knees in the mud, and Baron Jack Collins, who arrived home an hour after Margaret, was met at the door by his wife's composed account of the evening's necessity, and did not ask where his daughter was until morning. By then she was gone. His Grace Nicholas Woodward, the Duke of Ashendon, had not intended to travel the Hartwell Road that night. His original route from London, he had been up to town for a meeting with his land steward and a separate, an exhausting audience with his solicitors regarding a trust dispute that had been dragging through the courts for the better part of 3 years, would have taken him directly to the Ashendon estate via the Eastern Road. But the Eastern Road bridge had flooded in the storm, and his driver had taken the Hartwell detour without informing him until they were already on it. The Duke had been reading by carriage lamp and had not noticed the change until the vehicle slowed at the Collins estate gate. He had looked up at the sound of voices. What he saw stopped him in the way that only genuine injustice can stop a person of conscience, not with dramatic outrage, but with a very quiet, very cold clarity. A young woman in a ruined blue gown, kneeling in the mud, while a well-dressed woman delivered pronouncements from a dry doorway, surrounded by witnesses clearly gathered for the purpose of witnessing. Nicholas Woodward had grown up in one of the most socially stratified households in England. He had watched the mechanisms of aristocratic cruelty operate since childhood. He knew what public shaming looked like. He knew the architecture of it, the audience, the careful language, the strategic withdrawal of shelter. And he felt, looking at it from the road through the Collins estate gate, something he could only describe as a very specific kind of fury, He stepped out of the carriage before his footman could open the door properly. The gate was unlatched. Part of the staging, he would realize later. Margaret had wanted the road visible. She had wanted, perhaps, the slight possibility that society might witness her righteousness. She had not anticipated that society would step through the gate and look at her the way the Duke of Ashenden was now looking at her, with the flat, cold assessment of a man who had more social capital than she would ever accumulate, and who was directing every ounce of it toward communicating, without a single word, exactly what he thought of what he had just observed. Margaret Collins stared at him across the wet courtyard, and felt, for the first time in 4 years of careful scheming, the sensation of a plan encountering something it had not planned for. Nicholas crossed the courtyard and stood over the young woman in the mud. He extended his hand. He waited. She looked up at him. He registered the face, the expression on it, or the particular quality of a person in shock who has not yet been given permission to be otherwise. And then she took his hand. He did not pull her up with the theatrical urgency of a man performing rescue. He simply provided steady resistance, allowed her to find her footing on the slick stones, and when she was standing, kept hold of her hand for exactly 2 more seconds, long enough to be sure she was steady, and then released it. "My carriage is at the gate," he said quietly. "You should not be standing in the rain." Abigail looked at him. Rain ran down her face. She was shaking, cold or shock or both. "I do not know you," she said, which was, he thought, an extraordinary thing for a woman in her situation to think to say. "No," he agreed. "And yet I suspect you have had enough experience tonight of people who do know you acting with considerably less decency than a stranger might. My name is Nicholas Woodward. If that is sufficient introduction under the circumstances, my carriage is waiting." A pause. Short. She was thinking. He could see it, the mind working even through the shock, evaluating, assessing. Another woman might have crumbled or simply followed without question. She was calculating whether this was safer than the mud. "Nicholas Woodward," she repeated. And then, very quietly, "The Duke of Ashenden." Yes, she looked at his carriage, then back at him. Then, and this was the moment he would remember most clearly, she straightened her spine and met his eyes with what he could only call dignity. Not gratitude, not relief, not the desperate compliance of a woman with no options. Dignity, as though she were accepting assistance as a choice, not a surrender. "Thank you," she said. He walked her to the carriage. Behind them, from the shelter of the doorway, Margaret Collins watched in silence. The expression on her face was no longer composed. In the carriage, wrapped in the travelling blanket his footman produced with the practiced efficiency of a man long accustomed to the Duke's tendency to encounter unexpected situations, Abigail sat very still and looked at her hands. "Where would you like to be taken?" Nicholas asked. She thought about it for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. He understood that it was not indecision, but a genuine absence of answer, that she was, in that moment, working out that there was nowhere obvious to name. "I am not certain," she said, very honestly. "My father is at the Hargreaves' dinner. I have no close family nearby. The friends I might have gone to have likely already heard the account that was circulated tonight." He looked at her steadily. The carriage lamp threw warm light across her face. Even soaked, even muddied, even in shock, he noted, with the clinical observation of a man trained by years of legal and social affairs to see past surface conditions. There was nothing about her that resembled what had been declared in that courtyard. "The Ashenden Dower House is 4 miles from here," he said. "It is currently unoccupied, but is fully maintained. My housekeeper, Mrs. Turner is resident. You would have appropriate shelter, complete propriety, and time to determine your next step without the pressure of the next few hours. Another pause. Why? She asked. It was, again, not the question most women in her situation would have thought to ask. He found he respected it. Because what I just witnessed was a performance designed to destroy someone, he said, and I prefer not to be the person who drives past such things. Abigail Collins was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded once. The Dower House, she said. Thank you. Nicholas instructed his driver, settled back against the carriage seat, and looked out at the storm. Across from him, Abigail pulled the blanket around her shoulders and said nothing more for the remainder of the journey. But she sat upright, and by the time they arrived, the shaking had mostly stopped. The Ashenden Dower House was a stone building of restrained elegance, the kind of structure that announced its quality through proportion and permanence rather than ostentation. Even in the rain, even at night, it had the quality of something that had stood for centuries and expected to stand for several more. Mrs. Turner, round-faced, efficient, and possessed of the unshakable composure particular to housekeepers who have served great houses long enough to know that the gentry's dramas, however spectacular, were manageable, opened the door before the carriage had fully stopped, holding a lamp and a shawl with equal readiness. Your Grace, she said, was taking in the situation with a single practiced glance. And a guest. Miss Abigail Collins, Nicholas said. She will need the guest rooms prepared, dry clothes if anything can be found, and something hot. She has had a difficult evening. Mrs. Turner did not ask questions. This was one of her finest qualities. She simply extended the shawl toward Abigail and said, Come in out of the rain, miss. Everything else can be sorted. Abigail spent her first night at the Dower House, in a clean bed with clean sheets, wearing a dress borrowed from the housekeeper's own spare wardrobe, warm soup inside her, and the doors locked. She lay in the dark and did not sleep for a long time. She thought, with methodical precision, about what had happened. Not the emotional event of it. She was not ready for that. Not yet. But the mechanics. What Margaret had done and why. What the consequences would be and how quickly they would travel. What she had and what she did not. She had, she concluded, almost nothing. No home, no social standing, no financial independence. A father who, at the moment of crisis, had trusted his wife's account over his daughter's character, a reputation that had been publicly destroyed in the most effective possible setting. She had, however, one thing. She knew the truth. And she had been offered the assistance of a man with the social standing, legal resources, and apparent moral conviction to do something with it, if she chose to trust him with what she knew. She lay in the dark and thought about the Duke's face in the carriage lamplight. The steadiness of him, the quality of his stillness. She had been raised to be cautious about men who offered assistance too readily. But there had been nothing ready about his assistance, no performance of gallantry, no self-congratulation in the gesture. He had simply done it with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a person who sees a wrong and corrects it, because that is what one does. She decided, before sleep finally found her, to trust him enough to tell him what she knew. In the morning. Nicholas did not return to the Dower House until noon. He had spent the morning in his study at Ashenden House, writing 3 letters, one to Gabriel Austin, whose name and connection to the case he had extracted, with some careful questioning of his footman, who had once worked in the Williams household, before he even returned home. One to Victoria Hayward, who was an old acquaintance of his mother's, and who he suspected had already formed her own doubts, and one to his own solicitor, instructing him to begin a discreet review of the Collins estate's financial arrangements. He was not sure yet what he was dealing with. But the courtyard scene had told him enough. This was not an impulsive domestic dispute. It was orchestrated, and orchestrated things had architects, and architects left traces. When he arrived at the dower house, Abigail was seated in the morning room with a pot of tea and a piece of paper on which she had been writing, in small, methodical handwriting, everything she remembered. Every event, every conversation, every detail she could place in sequence. He looked at the paper, then at her. "You have been doing my work for me," he observed. "I have been doing my work," she corrected, with a precision that told him she was feeling considerably more herself than she had been the previous night. "I suspect our interests may align." They sat across from each other in the morning room of the dower house, and Abigail Collins told Duke Nicholas Woodward everything she knew, clearly, without dramatics, without self-pity. She laid out the inheritance clause, the brooch, Gabriel Austen's visit, Margaret's behaviour at the Hargreaves' dinner, and her own conclusions about the motivation behind it all. Nicholas listened without interrupting. He was a good listener, the kind that made the speaker feel their words were being taken seriously rather than simply received. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You have a strong instinct for evidence," he said. "Oh, I have a strong motivation to collect it," she replied. He almost smiled. It was not quite a smile, more a slight shift of expression that acknowledged the observation as worth making. "Gabriel Austen is already involved," he told her. "I have written to him. He will come within the week. And Mrs. Hayward—" He watched her react to the name, saw the slight tension in her expression. "Does not believe what she was told. I am fairly certain of that." "Margaret chose her targets carefully," Abigail said. "Victoria Hayward is the wife of the magistrate. If she believes the accusation, the official channels follow naturally." "Yes, but Margaret may have miscalculated Victoria Hayward's capacity for independent thought." He paused. "She frequently miscalculates people who think for themselves. It is a common flaw in those who rely on social manipulation. They believe everyone processes information the same way they do." Abigail looked at him. There was something in the way he spoke about manipulation that suggested personal familiarity, not as a practitioner, but as someone who had, at some point, been the subject of it. She did not ask. Not yet. But she noted it. Gabriel Austen arrived on a Thursday, riding hard from London in a manner that suggested he had received Nicholas's letter and departed within the hour. He was shown into the dower house study, which had become, over the preceding days, the operational centre of what Nicholas had privately begun to think of as the Collins inquiry, and sat down across from both of them with the alert energy of a man who had found the kind of case he existed to take on. "Is Lucy," he said without preamble, "is prepared to make a formal statement." This landed in the room the way significant things do. Not with a bang, but with a shift in weight, a rebalancing of what was possible. "She will lose her position," Abigail said immediately. "She has already been dismissed," Gabriel said. "Mrs. Collins dismissed her 3 days after my visit to Hartwell Park. I believe the dismissal was a warning and an attempt to make her unavailable. Instead, it has freed her from the constraint of employment loyalty." Lucy had seen more than the brooch. This was what Gabriel now explained, speaking quickly and precisely, pulling papers from his leather case as he went. Lucy had been in service at Hartwell Park for 3 years. In that time, she had seen and heard things that she had processed, as servants were trained to process the affairs of their employers, as information that was not her business. But she had retained it with the perfect, involuntary accuracy of someone who was paying close attention even when she told herself she was not. She had heard Margaret in private conversation with Mr. Aldridge, the family solicitor, on 2 separate occasions. She had understood some of what was said, enough to know it concerned Miss Abigail's inheritance and involved documents. She had once seen, through a door left slightly ajar, Margaret examining papers that she subsequently locked in the small secretary desk in her morning room, a desk Abigail had no access to. She had witnessed, on a Tuesday night 3 weeks before the dinner party, Margaret placing something in the alcove off the main corridor. The item she placed there was small and caught the lamplight in the way metal does. A silver brooch. "There is more," Gabriel said, leaning forward. Aldridge, the solicitor, retired unexpectedly last month. Suddenly, he has removed himself to his sister's house in Bath. I have sent a letter but not yet received a reply. However, I have spoken to his junior clerk, a young man called Mr. Peter Sands, who left the firm shortly before Aldridge's retirement, and who has certain observations about the nature of some documents he was asked to prepare in the last year. "What kind of documents?" Nicholas asked. "A codicil," Gabriel said. "Added to Baron Collins' will. The clerk does not have the document. He was not a party to the final preparation, but he saw its early draft. It altered the terms of Miss Collins's inheritance claim. The room was very quiet. "My father signed a codicil," Abigail said. "Or someone signed it for him," Gabriel said carefully. "I am not prepared to make that allegation yet. But the clerk's observation was that the Baron was not present for the meeting in which the initial draft was discussed." Abigail sat with this for a moment. Inheritance law in Victorian England was not simple. Under the Married Women's Property Act of 1882, recently passed, still contested in many households, women had greater rights to property than they had previously held. But a will's terms were binding, and a codicil, if properly executed, could modify those terms entirely. If Margaret had managed to introduce a codicil that altered or voided Abigail's claim, or the financial motive for the social destruction was even clearer, she had already moved to strip Abigail of the legal claim, and the reputational destruction was insurance, ensuring that even if the codicil were challenged, Abigail's character was too damaged to make a compelling case in court. It was, Abigail reflected, quite sophisticated, and it had nearly worked. "We need the codicil document itself," Nicholas said. "We need Aldridge," Gabriel agreed. "And we need my father," Abigail said, with the quieter weight of a person naming the hardest part. The following 2 weeks were the most peculiar of Abigail's life. They were peculiar because they were, against all probability, also the most purposeful she had felt in years. She was housed comfortably, if unconventionally, in the dower house with Mrs. and Turner as a model of propriety, and the investigation as occupation. Nicholas came daily, sometimes twice, and they worked with Gabriel Austen's correspondence, with Luca Williams' testimony. He had come in person once, greatly distressed, and had spoken to both of them with the earnestness of a man who had genuinely cared for Abigail, and was now channeling that care into something practical, and with a growing collection of documents, letters, and witness accounts. It was, Abigail thought, rather like assembling a portrait, one piece at a time, each element revealing a little more of the face, until the whole picture emerged with a clarity that had been invisible when you were standing too close to it. Luca Williams, for his part, was invaluable. He had, without Abigail's knowledge, kept every letter she had ever sent him, which, or in the context of Victorian courtship, meant careful, proper correspondence, with nothing that could be misconstrued by anyone reading it at face value. But he had also kept the letter Margaret had shown to others, the one whose phrases had been taken out of context, and when placed beside the full correspondence, the selective reading became immediately apparent. "She excerpted it," Luca said, his voice tight with a controlled anger that Abigail found more comforting than she would have expected. 3 lines from a letter of 5 pages, and she found the 3 lines that, without their surrounding paragraphs, suggest exactly what she needed them to suggest. "Which means she read the entire letter before she excerpted it," Nicholas observed. "Which means she had access to your correspondence." "I kept her letters," Luca said, looking at Abigail. "In a box in my study. I did not think they required securing." Abigail thought of all the ways Margaret might have accessed a box in a young man's study, through a servant of his who could be paid, through a social call and a moment of distraction, through the solicitor's office, if Aldridge had been party to this from the beginning. The picture was wide now, wider than a simple grudge or a domestic dispute. It was a sustained, premeditated campaign. Victoria Hayward came to the Dower House on a Friday afternoon, unannounced, arriving in her own carriage while Abigail and Nicholas were reviewing the clerk's statement. Nicholas received her in the drawing room, and Abigail, sitting just beyond the door in the study, heard the conversation through the wall. "I have had doubts from the beginning," Victoria said, or with the decisive tone of a woman who had finished arguing with herself. The story had the quality of something too complete, too many details arriving too quickly, all pointing in the same direction. Real scandals are messier. They have gaps and contradictions. This one was seamless. A pause. "Seamless things are made." "What are you prepared to do with your doubts?" Nicholas asked. "Whatever is required," Victoria Hayward said. "My husband is the magistrate of this county. If there is evidence of a deliberate legal fraud in addition to a social one, his office becomes directly relevant. And I have made him aware of my concerns." Abigail sat in the study with her hands folded in her lap and felt, for the first time since the night of the rain, something that she cautiously identified as hope. But the letter from Aldridge arrived on a Monday. It was brief, handwritten, and slightly unsteady in its script, the penmanship of a man under some internal pressure. "I am prepared to make a statement. I was asked to prepare documents I should not have prepared. I have been troubled by this matter for some time. I will receive Mr. Austen at my sister's address in Bath at his earliest convenience." Gabriel was on the road to Bath the following morning. Meanwhile, Nicholas had been managing the social dimensions of the situation with the quiet effectiveness of a man who understood that, in Victorian England, the war for truth was fought on 2 fronts simultaneously, the legal and the social, and that winning only one was insufficient. He had, with the calibrated precision of someone who knew exactly how aristocratic social networks operated, begun to speak. Not broadly, not dramatically, but to precisely the right people, at precisely the right moments, with precisely the right degree of controlled concern about what he had witnessed and what he was beginning to understand. The narrative began to shift. Within the drawing rooms of Wiltshire society, stories had a particular kind of half-life. A scandal, once launched, moved fast and burned hot. But it also, if the right conditions were not maintained, began to cool. It needed continuous feeding, fresh details, continued social ostracism, the visible confirmation of the accused's guilt through their own distress or disappearance. What it could not survive was counter-narrative, delivered with authority by someone whose opinion the room respected. Duke Nicholas Woodward had, over the course of 2 weeks, had conversations at his club, at 2 separate dinners, and during a hunt breakfast at Lord Hartfield's estate. These conversations were not confrontational. They were, rather, a series of carefully placed questions. "Curious thing about the Collins affair," he had remarked at the club, to no one in particular. The timeline doesn't quite hold together, does it? And later, at dinner. Margaret Collins is a woman of considerable social skill. It is interesting, don't you find, when socially skilled people construct accusations that are, on examination, slightly too coherent? He did not say Abigail was innocent. He did not need to. He simply introduced doubt, as in doubt, in a room that had been given certainty without evidence, was extraordinarily potent. Mrs. Victoria Hayward did her part as well. She had a conversation with Mrs. Hargreaves, who had hosted the dinner, and who had, she admitted, felt uneasy about the whole business, even as she had participated in the social withdrawal, that left Mrs. Hargreaves with a great deal to reconsider. Luca Williams, who had not been to any social function since the scandal broke, now appeared at one, composed, accompanied by Gabriel Austin, and publicly visible as a man who had not distanced himself from the accused. In the language of Victorian social signalling, this was a statement. Margaret Collins, who had spent the past 3 weeks waiting for the social execution she had staged to complete itself, began to notice that it was not completing, that conversations at her morning calls were slightly shorter than usual, that invitations were not arriving with their customary frequency, that her daughter Phoebe was coming home from her afternoon visits with an expression of confused distress. She had expected Abigail to disappear. Instead, Abigail was still present in the county, invisibly from the dower house, and something was gathering. Margaret felt it the way animals are said to feel earthquakes, before the shaking, in the particular quality of the silence. She did not know about Gabriel Austin in Bath. She did not know about the clerk's statement, or Lucy's formal account, or the magistrate's wife's changed position. She did not know, crucially, that Aldridge had not, as she had assumed, retreated into guilt-laden silence, but had instead been in correspondence with a solicitor of the opposing party. She had made the assumption that the people she had been careful to terrify into compliance were still terrified. She had miscalculated the degree to which terror, when given a viable alternative, transforms into testimony. It was during this period, the investigative middle weeks, that something else began, slowly, to happen. Abigail and Nicholas spent a great deal of time together. This was, in the first instance, practical. He had the resources and connections the investigation required, and she had the knowledge and clarity of thought to direct them. But the hours they spent in the dower house study, reading documents and composing letters and arguing occasionally about the best approach to a particular problem, these hours accumulated, while she learned that he was exacting and impatient in equal measure, that he expected precision and was genuinely delighted when he encountered it, that he had a particular way of reading, leaning forward slightly, very still, and that when something in a document confirmed what he had suspected, there was a brief flash of satisfaction in his expression before he controlled it back into neutrality. He learned that she was formidably organized, that she had an unusual capacity for sitting with difficult information without becoming overwhelmed by it, and that she had a dry wit she deployed rarely but with extraordinary accuracy, always at exactly the moment when the atmosphere had become too heavy and needed puncturing. She had a habit, when thinking, of pressing the tip of her pen lightly against her lower lip. He caught himself noticing this on a Tuesday afternoon and spent the next 20 minutes being irritated with himself for it. "You are distracted," Abigail said, without looking up from the letter she was reading. "I am thinking," he said. "You are doing a particularly focused kind of not thinking," she said, "which is different. You do it when there is something you are deciding whether to say." He looked at her. "You are unusually observant," he said. "You are unusually transparent," she replied, "for a man who believes he is inscrutable." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It had the quality of something being understood, rather than something being left unsaid. He said, "When this is over." And she said, with a quiet steadiness that told him she was also, in her careful way, deciding something. "When this is over." Which was not an answer, technically, but it was a very great deal more than nothing. The occasion that Gabriel Austen and Nicholas identified as the appropriate venue for what they had taken to calling the resolution was a gathering hosted, with accidental perfection, by Baron Jack Collins himself. The Baron had, at Margaret's instigation, arranged an autumn reception at Hartwell Park for the local gentry, an event that had been scheduled before any of the current troubles, and which Margaret had kept on the calendar, because cancelling it would have suggested a household in disorder. She needed things to appear exactly as normal. She had not anticipated that her stepson-in-law's gathering would become the setting for her own exposure. They arrived in 3 carriages. Nicholas first. His presence at any county gathering was unexceptional and expected. Gabriel Austen and Luca Williams together, which was slightly unusual but not remarkable. And Abigail last, with Victoria Hayward, which was, when the carriage door opened and Abigail stepped out beside the magistrate's wife, the first public statement of the evening. The Hartwell Park drawing room fell into an unusual, attentive silence as the assemblage processed this combination of arrivals. Margaret Collins, standing near the fireplace, in a new silk gown the colour of old roses, went very still. Baron Jack Collins, who had been told that morning by Nicholas himself, in a private conversation of considerable frankness, that he had been the subject of a manipulation, that his daughter was not guilty of what she had been accused, and that the evidence to prove this was assembled and waiting, stood beside the fireplace in the posture of a man who had been awake for most of the preceding night and was doing his best to hold himself together. He looked at his daughter when she entered. She looked at him. There was a great deal in that look that could not be resolved in a single evening, but she gave him a small nod, not of forgiveness, not yet, but of acknowledgement that she understood what she had been told this morning had cost him, that she was willing to proceed. He nodded back. His jaw was very tight. Nicholas moved through the room with the measured patience of a man who knows the exact moment to act and is prepared to wait for it. He greeted guests. He accepted wine. He spoke pleasantly about the weather. It was Gabriel who opened the formal proceedings in the way that Gabriel Austen always opened formal proceedings, not with drama, but with precision, in the manner of a man placing evidence before a court. He approached Margaret Collins with a small bow and a leather folder in his hand. "Mrs. Collins, I believe you are acquainted with Mr. Aldridge, formerly of Aldridge and Partners, or to solicitors." A careful pause. Something shifted behind Margaret's eyes. "I am his client," she said. "You were," Gabriel said. "Mr. Aldridge has provided a sworn statement regarding the preparation of a codicil to Baron Collins's will. A codicil which, he attests, was presented to him with a falsified instruction claiming to come from the Baron, but which the Baron himself was not present to sign, and whose signature Mr. Aldridge now believes wasn't executed with the Baron's full understanding of its terms." The room had gone from attentive silence to the kind of absolute stillness that happens when a gathering of social animals collectively understands that something real is occurring. Margaret's voice, when it came, was very controlled, but the control was the kind that requires effort, and the effort showed. "I don't know what you think you are implying." "I am not implying," Gabriel said. "I have a sworn statement. I have a second statement from Mr. Peter Sands, formerly clerk of the same firm, regarding the preparation of documents he was instructed to alter. And I have, in this folder, copies of the relevant correspondence, including letters sent to 3 members of this county's social community, containing, I would submit, knowingly false information about the character of Miss Abigail Collins. The sound of the fire, the sound of people breathing. And then Lucy spoke. Lucy, who was standing near the door. She had been brought at Victoria Hayward's specific invitation as Mrs. Hayward's guest, which gave her a social legitimacy within the room that could not be casually dismissed, said clearly and without trembling. I saw Mrs. Collins place the brooch in the corridor alcove. The same evening it was later found and presented as evidence of Miss Abigail's theft. I saw this with my own eyes. 3 seconds of silence, and then Abigail spoke. She had not planned a speech. She was not, by temperament, a person who prepared speeches. But she had spent the past several weeks thinking, with considerable clarity, about what mattered and what she wanted, said before this assembly of people who had formed their opinion of her based on information they had been given without her voice in the room. She stepped forward slightly. I would like to say one thing, she said. Her voice was even, clear. The voice of a woman who had knelt in the mud 3 weeks ago and was, demonstrably, still standing. I did not steal from this household. I did not conduct myself improperly. I did not do anything I was accused of. I was accused because I was in someone's way, specifically because I had a legal claim that someone wished to extinguish and a future that someone wished to prevent. That is the simple truth of what occurred here. I do not say this to humiliate anyone. I say it because the truth was not allowed into this room the first time, and it belongs here. She stopped. The room looked at Margaret Collins. Margaret Collins looked at the room, and for the first time in 4 years of managing this household through the mechanisms of social authority and carefully cultivated appearances, she found that none of those mechanisms were available to her. The room was not afraid of her. The room had the evidence against her, and the room contained both the Duke of Ashendon and the magistrate's wife, which meant the legal consequences of the next few hours were entirely beyond her control. She sat down, not strategically, not gracefully. She sat down on the nearest chair because her legs had made a decision before her composure could override it. Baron Jack Collins crossed the room to his daughter. He said her name. Just that, Abigail, in a voice that contained everything he had failed to say in the past 3 weeks, and possibly in the past 10 years, and she looked at him and understood, with the particular clarity of a person who has been through something genuinely terrible and come out the other side of it, that his failure was not the same as his absence of love. It was not a simple forgiveness. It would take longer than an evening. But she put her hand on his arm and kept it there. The formal proceedings that followed the Hartwell Park confrontation were less dramatic than the confrontation itself. Legal things rarely had the same urgency of feeling as the human events they documented, but they were, Abigail found, deeply satisfying in their own precise way. Margaret Collins did not contest the evidence. There was, ultimately, nothing to contest. Gabriel Austin had assembled a file of documentation that would have been formidable in any court in England, and Margaret was too intelligent a woman to spend social and legal capital on a case she could not win. She acknowledged, through her own solicitor, hastily engaged, that certain documents had been improperly prepared, and that the accusations she had made publicly against her stepdaughter had been based on misunderstanding. This was a legal formulation, not a confession, but it was sufficient. The codicil to Baron Collins's will was set aside as improperly executed. The original terms of the will were reinstated. Abigail's inheritance claim was legally restored. Margaret's position within the household became, rapidly, and without anyone needing to state it explicitly, untenable. She and Phoebe removed to Margaret's sister's house in Cheltenham before the month was out. Phoebe wrote to Abigail before she left. The letter was short and uncertain and genuine. The letter of a girl who did not know what her mother had done until it was done, and who did not know how to carry the weight of it. "I am sorry," it said. "I did not know." "I am not sure that helps, but I am sorry," Abigail wrote back. It was not effusive, but it was kind. Because Phoebe was 14 years old and had chosen none of this, and cruelty in response to cruelty, Abigail had decided, was not a cycle she wished to continue. Baron Jack Collins spent the weeks following the confrontation doing something that was, for him, extremely difficult. Reckoning. He had been manipulated. He had not been stupid. Margaret had been very good at what she did, and the evidence had been carefully fabricated. But he had also chosen, at several critical moments, to not look too hard at what was in front of him. He had preferred the peace of a running household to the disruption of uncomfortable questions, and his daughter had paid the price of that preference. He said this to Abigail directly, without hedging, without distributing the blame more broadly than it belonged. She listened, and she told him the truth, that it would take time, that the hurt didn't disappear because the cause of it had been explained, but that she didn't want to lose what remained of their relationship over a woman who was no longer in it. They were tentative with each other for some time after that, but they were trying, and trying, Abigail had concluded, was the beginning of everything. The question of Duke Nicholas Woodward resolved itself, as the best things tend to do, through the simple accumulation of honest time spent together. After the legal proceedings were concluded, and there was no longer an investigation to provide the daily architecture of their meetings, there was a brief and peculiar period, perhaps 10 days, in which neither of them was quite sure what form their association should take. He called at Hartwell Park on a Thursday afternoon, correctly and formally, and was received in the morning room by Abigail and her father. He and the Baron discussed various matters. He was civil and appropriate, and absolutely maddening, Abigail thought, in the way he was being civil and appropriate. She walked him to his carriage when he left. The afternoon was cool and blue, nothing like the storm of a month ago, and the elm trees along the drive were turning gold. "You said," Abigail began, looking at the drive rather than at him, "that when this was over, and then you stopped." "I did," he agreed. "I thought you ought to finish the sentence," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I intended to say that when this was over, I should very much like to know you outside the context of a crisis. I find that I think considerably more clearly when we are in the same room, which is, given that I thought I managed reasonably well on my own before, rather illuminating." She turned to look at him. "That is a very restrained declaration," she said. "I am a very restrained man," he said, "generally." "And unrestrained?" she asked. The pause that followed was brief, but it was the kind of pause that held a great deal. "Unrestrained," he said, "but I would tell you that you are the most remarkable person I have encountered in the entirety of my adult life, and that the 3 weeks I have spent in your company have been, despite, or perhaps because of, their complete departure from ordinary circumstances, the most genuinely alive I have felt in years." The elm trees made a sound in the wind. Abigail looked at the Duke of Ushenden, at the carefully maintained composure, at the grey eyes that were, she had learned, considerably warmer than they initially appeared, and felt, for the first time in this story, entirely and properly like herself. "In that case," she said, "I think you should call again. Tomorrow." "Not on business." "Tomorrow?" he agreed. He did not take her hand. That would come, properly, with gloves, in a garden, on a clear day, with her father's blessing, which was given with both relief and a slight expression that suggested the Baron was aware he had very little standing to object to anything his daughter chose to do with her future. The formal courtship that followed was proper in every public particular. In private, in the morning room, with the firelight and the papers they had stopped needing, and the conversations that went longer and further than investigations required, it was something else. Something that could not be staged or scripted or destroyed by anyone's careful, calculated plan. Something that had, perhaps, been decided on a stormy night in a muddy courtyard, when a woman in a ruined blue gown looked up and took a stranger's hand. Before we close this chapter of Abigail's journey, I want to ask you something. Do you believe that dignity can truly survive the cruelest betrayal? That truth, no matter how long it is buried, always finds its way to the light? If this story moved you even a little, if Abigail's courage stirred something in you, take just a moment right now to subscribe, smash that like button, and leave a comment telling us your thoughts. Where are you watching from? What part of this story hit you the hardest? Your support keeps stories like this alive, and means more than you know. And so, what began as a night of disgrace in the rain became the turning point of a life reclaimed. Not through fortune, not through the intervention of someone more powerful rescuing someone powerless, but through the convergence of truth, courage, and the simple, the radical decision made by a young woman kneeling in the mud to reach up and take a hand, and then, more importantly, to stand. Abigail Collins did not regain her dignity the night Nicholas Woodward offered her shelter. She had never lost it. What she regained over those weeks of work and testimony and deliberate, careful truth-telling was the world's recognition of what had always been there. This is, in many ways, the deeper lesson of her story, and of Victorian England's complicated machinery of social reputation more broadly. The Married Women's Property Act of 1882, which features in Abigail's inheritance claim, was a radical legal shift for its era. It allowed married women to own and control their own property, independent of their husbands. But the social architecture that surrounded this legal reality was still deeply resistant to women who exercised agency over their own lives and futures. Women's reputations remained a form of social currency that others could devalue, and Margaret Collins understood this mechanism better than most, because she had spent her life learning to navigate it. What she had not accounted for was that the same system that could be used to destroy a reputation could also be used to restore one, if the truth was sufficiently documented and the right people were prepared to speak it. Gabriel Austin, Luca Williams, Lucy, Victoria Hayward, each of them made a choice. They chose the discomfort of honesty over the comfort of complicity. In doing so, they did not merely help one woman, or they demonstrated something about the nature of systems built on suppression. They depend entirely on the silence of those who know better. The moment that silence breaks, everything that was built on it becomes unstable. As for Nicholas Woodward, the Duke of Ashendon, who stepped out of his carriage on a flooded detour on a stormy night in Wiltshire, he would say, years later, that he had not done anything particularly heroic. He had simply done what was obvious. He had simply looked at what was in front of him and done the obvious thing. He had, of course, also fallen in love. But he considered that separately. Truth, though delayed, carries a weight no deception can withstand, and sometimes the carriage that stops in the storm does not merely offer shelter, it changes destiny. Thank you for staying with Abigail's story from the first rain-soaked moment to this. These narratives of courage, injustice, and the relentless possibility of truth are worth telling precisely because they are not so far from the realities that ordinary people in every era have faced. The settings change, the social machinery evolves, but the fundamental experience of being silenced, of having your truth taken from you, and of finding the strength and the allies to reclaim it, that is timeless. We will see you in the next story.